Morning, we addressed the question, should Christians keep the Sabbath? And I believe that the biblical answer to that is no. And I made three basic arguments. Actually, I only had time to present two of the three arguments. But the first argument that I made was that the covenant commanding Sabbath keeping was only made with the Jews. It was not made with the patriarchs before Israel. It was not made with the surrounding nations. It was not made with the Gentiles. It was made with the Jews alone. And therefore, if you're not a Jew, you've never been obligated to keep the Sabbath. But then the second argument that I made is that the covenant commanding Sabbath keeping has been replaced by the new covenant. And we looked at several passages from the New Testament to support that second point. I didn't have time to make the third point of my basic argument, and that is that the Jewish Sabbath was not observed in the early post-apostolic period. And there are quotations from secular history showing that in the 2nd century, Christians did not keep the Sabbath as had the Jews. I shared with you some of those quotations in the last What Is Written study that we had. So that was the basic argument that I presented last week. There was one thing that I want to mention this morning that I didn't have time to mention last week, and that is that the Old Testament provides several regulations pertaining to the Sabbath. There was to be no cooking, they were not to leave their homes, no work was to be done, no burdens were to be borne, no fires were to be kindled. 2 lambs were to be offered every Sabbath in addition to the daily offerings that were made every day. The priests were to prepare the showbread every Sabbath. There was to be no buying and selling. The gates of Jerusalem were locked, and those who violated the Sabbath were to be put to death. Now, why am I mentioning that? Well, I'm mentioning that because Sabbatarians today, those who argue that we need to be keeping the Sabbath, they don't follow these regulations. So even though they say that we need to keep the Sabbath today, they do not keep the Sabbath as it was prescribed by God in the Old Covenant. I think that's a problem. If you're going to argue that we need to keep the Sabbath, then why not keep every aspect, every part of the instructions that God gave to Israel? Well, in the time that we have this morning, I want to look at some of the major arguments that Sabbatarians offer to support their view that Christians should keep the Sabbath today. And we're going to focus on arguments that they make from the Old Testament. And then, Lord willing, next week we'll conclude our study by looking at some arguments that they make from the New Testament. Please understand that what I'm doing this morning, really what I'm doing in this series, is trying to equip the saints. I'm trying to give you instruction that will help you understand biblical teaching concerning the Sabbath, and also help you, if you have the opportunity, to talk to a Seventh-day Adventist or someone from another church that believes that we should keep the Sabbath today. Part of my responsibility as a preacher is to equip the saints to do the work of ministry, Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4. And so, I want to try to answer some of the major arguments that Sabbatarians make from the Old Testament. I can't look at every argument. I have about 30 in my notes from the Old Testament alone. We'll be able to look at maybe 5 or so. But I think these are the major arguments. I think these are the strongest arguments that they make. And yet I believe when you weigh these arguments in the balance, if I can borrow the words from Daniel chapter 5, they're found to be wanting. One of the strongest arguments that Sabbatarians make is that God blessed and sanctified the Sabbath at creation. And they appeal to Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, which says, "And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the Sabbath day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the Sabbath day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made." Now, once again, let me remind you that last week I told you that God made the Sabbath covenant with Israel alone. But Sabbatarians argue from this passage that what I just said is not correct. Because this passage says, "Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it." Well, I want you to notice how this third verse is translated in the old King James Version. It reads, "And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made." Young's literal translation reads, "And God blesseth the seventh day and sanctifieth it, for in it he hath ceased from all his work which God had prepared for making." I want you to notice some things that this passage does not say. First of all, this passage does not say that the seventh day of creation week was called the Sabbath. You're not going to find the term Sabbath in Genesis chapter 2. Secondly, this passage does not say that God commanded Adam and Eve to keep the Sabbath. In fact, it doesn't say that God commanded anyone to keep the Sabbath at this time. And I would suggest to you that this passage does not necessarily say that God sanctified the seventh day at that time. Now, I need to explain what I mean. We may very well have a figure of speech that is called prolepsis. And that figure is called, or the figure is so called, Mr. Bullinger says in his figures of speech used in the Bible, the figure is so called when we anticipate what is going to be done and speak of future things as present. Merriam-Webster's dictionary says that this term means anticipation, the representation or assumption of a future act or development as if presently existing or accomplished. And you're saying, what? Well, let me illustrate what I'm talking about. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 20, the record says, "And Adam called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of all living." Now, was Eve the mother of all living when Adam gave her the name Eve? No. She became the mother of all living later. This is an example of prolepsis. In Matthew chapter 10 and verse 4, when the 12 apostles are selected by the Lord, Simon the Canaanite is mentioned in verse 4, and then Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now, when Judas was selected, had he betrayed Jesus at that point? No. Remember, the Gospels were written many years after after the time of Christ. Maybe this chart will help me illustrate the point. You've got creation in the beginning, and Genesis 2 verse 2 says that God rested. Nehemiah tells us in Nehemiah chapter 9 that God made known the Sabbaths to Israel at Mount Sinai. And then Moses wrote the book of Genesis either at Sinai or during the wilderness wandering. Now, Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3 said that God blessed the seventh day. The question is, when did He do that? Did He do that at creation, or did He do that later when He made known the Sabbath to Israel at Mount Sinai? Remember, Moses wrote Genesis way back here. So when Moses says in Genesis 2 verse 3 that God blessed the Sabbath, is he talking about something that God did at creation, or is he talking about something that God did later? Let's take a closer look at Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3. Does it say that God blessed the Sabbath in that He would rest? Or, wait a minute, does it say that He would rest, that He was resting, or that He had rested when He blessed the Sabbath? Did God bless the Sabbath before He rested, while He was resting, or after He had rested? Well, Deuteronomy 5 verse 15 says that the Sabbath would be a memorial of Israel's exodus from Egypt. The term Sabbath is first used in the Bible in Exodus chapter 16 when God gave the manna to the Israelites. As I've already said, Nehemiah says that the Sabbath command was made known at Sinai. It would be a sign between God and Israel. It would be a memorial of the Exodus. Let's look at Exodus 6. I'm not going to take the time to turn to the passage, but let's think about Exodus chapter 16 a little bit closer. This is the first time that the seventh day is called the Sabbath in the Old Testament. And I would suggest to you that the context of this passage indicates that it was something that was new. The Sabbath was not something that the Israelites had been observing for centuries. God said in the fourth verse that He would test Israel when He offered them or gave them the manna. Said, you collect it 6 days a week. You don't collect it on the seventh day because there's not going to be any. He was testing Israel, and He gave them these instructions concerning the manna. Remember that there were some who went out on the seventh day to pick up the manna, and there wasn't any. I think that indicates that this was something new. If they'd been keeping the Sabbath for centuries, they would have known not going to be anything on the seventh day. This command or these instructions were given in anticipation of the fourth commandment given at Sinai. They're in the area of Sinai when the events of Exodus 16 occur. Let me also remind you that Numbers 15 tells us that during the wilderness wandering, after they've left Sinai, there was a fellow that went out and picked up sticks on the Sabbath. They bring him to Moses because they don't know what to do with him. And Moses seeks the counsel of the Lord, and the Lord tells them what they need to do. My point is, Israel didn't know what the punishment would be for violation of the Sabbath. If they had been observing the Sabbath for centuries, they would have known that. Exodus 16 was something that was new. Now, let's think about Genesis 2:3 and Nehemiah chapter 9 for a moment. Genesis 2:3 says that God blessed and sanctified the seventh day. Nehemiah 9:13 and 14 says that God made known the Sabbath at Sinai. So how do we harmonize these two passages? Well, the Sabbatarians argue that God blessed and sanctified and commanded the Sabbath at creation. That's their view. But that doesn't harmonize with Nehemiah 9:13, which says he made it known at Sinai. Well, a second possibility is that God blessed and sanctified the Sabbath at creation, but didn't command it to anybody at that time. That explanation would harmonize these two passages. But it seems to me that it's more likely that the third explanation is correct, and that is that God blessed and sanctified and commanded the Sabbath at Sinai. Sometimes Sabbatarians will argue that because God sanctified the Sabbath, therefore we need to keep it today. But the Old Testament record indicates that God sanctified all of these other things as well. Are they still binding today? Well, another argument that Sabbatarians are quick to make is that the Sabbath was to be kept forever in a perpetual covenant. In Exodus chapter 31, verses 16 and 17, the record says, "Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever." Sabbatarians are going to say, "Kevin, how can you say that we're not obligated to keep the Sabbath today when God said that it was a perpetual covenant? It was to be observed forever." Well, that's a good question. How would you answer it? Now, I'm asking you that question to hopefully help you see that this study will hopefully be helpful to you. Because my guess is that many of you don't know how to answer this argument. Well, don't feel badly, because I wouldn't have known how to answer it either some years ago before I spent some time studying this question. Verse 13 of this same chapter says that the Sabbath was to observe throughout their generations. Leviticus says it was a statute forever. It's part of an everlasting covenant. It's an ordinance forever. Well, the key thing here is, what does forever mean? It's the Hebrew word olam, and sometimes it means forever and ever and ever, but sometimes it just means for a long time. The Lexham Theological Wordbook says that this word means distant past, distant future, as long as something lasts, eternity. It says a period of time that either stretches into the far past or far future. This word essentially refers to a long period of time. Context determines whether this means eternity, a long time into the past, or a long time into the future. Josenius's Hebrew lexicon says that it means what is hidden, especially hidden time. Long, the beginning or end of which is either uncertain or else not defined. Notice that part of this quotation that's in blue. What is called the terminus ad quem, that's my best guess at that pronunciation, that means the ending point, is always defined from the nature of the thing itself. So sometimes it refers to what belongs to a whole race or dynasty or people, and it comprehends all the time until their destruction. Haley, in his book, The Alleged Discrepancy of the Bible, says the Hebrew word olam, rendered forever, does not imply the metaphysical idea of absolute endlessness, but a period of indefinite length. As Rambach says, a very long time, the end of which is hidden from us. We need to understand that forever things can cease. Circumcision was said to be a forever thing. But the New Testament clearly tells us that circumcision or uncircumcision under the new covenant of Christ doesn't matter. It's not important. The Passover was a forever thing, but we're not obligated to keep those Jewish feasts today, according to Colossians chapter 2. The Aaronic priesthood was a forever thing, but the book of Hebrews clearly tells us that that old priesthood has been replaced by the priesthood of Christ under the order of Melchizedek. The Day of Atonement was a forever thing, but that's been replaced by the sacrifice of Christ. The righteous ordinances of the law are described as forever things. But the New Testament teaches that the old law has been replaced. Jewish possession of the land was a forever thing. The Sabbath is described as a forever thing. The earth is described as a forever thing, and yet the New Testament teaches that this earth is going to be destroyed. So you see, the issue is, what does forever mean? Sometimes it means eternity. Sometimes it means forever and ever and ever, but sometimes it just means for a long time. Well, these New Testament passages indicate that several forever things can cease. Well, Sabbatarians are quick to argue that the law of Moses, what they call the ceremonial law, that's what was abolished at the cross. But the law of God, the moral law, the Ten Commandments, they continue to abide. We could graphically illustrate it like this. You've got the law of God, that's the Ten Commandments. You've got the law of Moses, that's the ceremonial laws. Christ comes along. Sabbatarians tell us that the law of Moses, the ceremonial law, it just extended to the cross. But God's moral law, the Ten Commandments, they continue forever. And Sabbatarians will appeal to 2 Kings chapter 21 and verse 8. And I will not make the feet of Israel wander anymore from the land which I gave their fathers, only if they are careful to do according to all that I have commanded them. Sabbatarians say, you see, that's God's law. That's the moral law. And according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. So you've got two laws. But I want you to notice how this is rendered in the parallel passage in 2 Chronicles chapter 33 and verse 8. And I will not again remove the foot of Israel from the land which I have appointed for your fathers, only if they are careful to do all that I have commanded them according to the whole law and the statutes and the ordinances by the hand of Moses. There's no distinction between the law of God and the law of Moses. The Bible never says that part of the law was abolished and part still abides. There is no distinction between the law of God and the law of Moses. Paul says in Romans 7, verse 4 and then verse 6 and 7 that Christians are discharged from the law, and it was the law that said you shall not covet. What law was that? Well, that was the 10th of the 10 Commandments. As we noted last week, Paul describes the old law as the ministry of death written on stones, and it was passing away. The chronicler says in verse 14 of chapter 34, now when they brought out the money that was brought into the house of the Lord, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Lord given by Moses. Same law. 1 Kings 2 verse 3 says, and keep the charge of the Lord your God to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments. Let me mention this quickly. Quite often when Sabbatarians see the word commandments, they just think 10 commandments. Well, God has other commandments. His judgments and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. My point is that the law of Moses contained it all. It contained God's statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies. Notice how these terms are used interchangeably in Ezra chapter 7. Verse 6 says, this Ezra came up from Babylon, and he was a skilled scribe in the law of Moses. Now look at verse 11. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave Ezra the priest, the scribe, expert in the words of the commandments of the law and of his statutes to Israel. Then later it goes on to say in verse 12, to Ezra the priest, a scribe of the law of the God of heaven. These terms, law of Moses, law of God, are used interchangeably in this context. Nehemiah 8 verse 14 reads, and they found written in the law which the Lord had commanded by Moses. Chapter 10 talks about God's law which was given by Moses, the servant of God. Luke 2 describes for us how Joseph and Mary went to Jerusalem to perform the purification rites after Jesus was born. And notice the language. Now, when the days of our purification according to the law of Moses were completed, but the next verse says, as it is written in the law of the Lord. The law of Moses was the law of the Lord. The law of the Lord was the law of Moses. All of these terms are used interchangeably in 2 Chronicles chapter 34 and 35, and again in Nehemiah chapter 8. This is a distinction without a difference, because the Old Testament indicates that the covenant was given by God and it was given by Moses. The law was given by God and given by Moses. The 10 Commandments were given by God and given by Moses. So no wonder Nehemiah 8 verse 14 reads, and they found written in the law which the Lord had commanded by Moses. In addition to that, the phrase the law of God or the law of the Lord is used when the text is talking about what Sabbatarians would call the ceremonial law. Burnt offerings, the Feast of the New Moons, the Feast of Tabernacles, the purification rituals. On the other hand, such commands as honor your father and your mother, the prohibition against homosexuality and bestiality and fornication and drunkenness, those are moral laws, and yet they were a part of the law of Moses. The law is described as the law of God because he's the author of it. But it's described as the law of Moses because he was the mediator of it. Well, Sabbatarians tell us, but now Isaiah 66, my secretary forgot to put a space between the period and 66. I hate it when that happens while I'm preaching, that I discover that. The Sabbath will be kept in heaven. Therefore, it should be kept here on earth today. Well, here's the passage. For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall your descendants and your name remain, and it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all flesh shall come to worship before me, says the Lord. Well, the Sabbatarians make several assumptions about this passage. First of all, that it refers to heaven as opposed to the Messianic age. They assume that if this happens in heaven later, then it should be done on earth now. I'll say more about that momentarily. They assume that the Sabbath should be observed now from this passage, but not the new moon. You see the problem? If this passage authorizes Sabbath keeping, it authorizes new moon keeping, and Sabbatarians don't do that. I believe that the new heavens and the new earth, at least in this passage, refers to the Messianic age, the age we're living in right now. But notice, it says that they would be worshiping from one new moon to another, from one Sabbath to another. That's describing continuous worship. Not just worship on the new moon and then the next new moon, the Sabbath and the next Sabbath, but continuous worship. And as I've already suggested, if this teaches Sabbath observance, it teaches new moon observance also. But Paul says, let no one judge you with respect to Sabbath days, feast days, etc. But then there's a fundamental problem with the idea that if something is done in heaven later, assuming, just for the sake of argument, that the Sabbatarians are right, that this is talking about something that happens in heaven, therefore it's okay or permissible for us here on earth, there's a problem with that. Because Jesus indicates that there's not going to be any marriage in the hereafter, but there's certainly marriage here. Christ is a high priest in heaven, but the Hebrew writer says he can't be a high priest here on earth. There's not going to be hunger, thirst, or tears in heaven, but we've sure got a bucket load of that here, don't we? There's not going to be Lord's Supper in heaven, but we observe the Lord's Supper till he comes today. Revelation talks about incense Revelation 5 verse 8, should we be burning incense today? There are just too many assumptions that the Sabbatarians make in this passage. That the new heavens and the new earth refer to the eternal state, that from one Sabbath to another means observing succeeding Sabbaths as opposed to continuous worship. So I would submit to you that this passage does not really do or teach what Sabbatarians claim. Well, I'm out of time, and we just were able to look at a few of their arguments, but I think these are some of the major arguments, and I hope you can see that they've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Certainly, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk with you further about anything that may not be clear or any other question. Lord willing, next week we'll look at some arguments from the New Testament. Remember, I'm trying to equip the saints to do the work of ministry. Thank you.